Thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. Since it's been so many decades since I've been actively involved in model building, it's a particular honor. When I look back on my career, which has now been very long, 40 or 50 years, it seems to me I've spent most of it saying I'm terribly sorry. It seemed like a good idea at the time. As I look back on it, I think I can remember I thought it was a good idea to target the exchange rate. I thought it was a good idea to target the Nehru. I thought it was a good idea to target the money supply. And all of those things, I now realize I was wrong. And I was wrong because the underlying belief was that the economy was actually deterministic, that it was understandable and it was fully controllable. And as the years have gone on, I think I've come to the conclusion that that's just not so. And that, in fact, a better starting point is to think about the economy as a complex adaptive system, you know, with a zillion different heterogeneous agents, each acting according to heuristic rules, simple heuristic rules, interacting, learning from each other, all that kind of stuff. And systems of this nature, okay, complex adaptive systems, are actually ubiquitous. You see them everywhere in society and in nature, except the one place that we don't seem to see them is in economics. And when you embrace this concept of it's complex and adaptive and it's constantly evolving, there's a lot of lessons for policy that come through just from the simple embrace of the concept. Item number one, for example, these systems always break down. Okay, so you should be prepared. Item number two, these systems are too complicated to really understand. And you really have to try to minimax rather than maximize. Lesson number three, they can break down in various ways. So focusing on just one thing, as if we get this right, everything's going to be right, doesn't work. Well, I've been back looking really at this sort of difference between your FPAS Mark 1 and Mark 2, and trying to see whether whether there's things in the transformation that I think I like, okay, from the perspective that I've been talking about, this complex adaptive. And in truth, there's at least 7 things that I can point to. These are from your videos, Doug, you know, that you've got up on your website. There's at least 7 things that I like. The first one is this idea that economists really can't forecast. And you only have to look back. I mean, you remember as well as I do the beginning of the great financial crisis. Okay, the OECD, the IMF, the central banks, they just totally missed it. In the last 10 years, again, if you look at the forecast, we've had almost 10 years in a row where growth for next year and inflation for next year has been projected to be much higher than actually occurred. Item number one, we can't forecast. Second, the recognition that alternative scenarios, you know, plausible stories beat baselines. I think that's a good development as well. Minimizing loss functions. Again, I think it's a very good idea. If you don't try to avoid really bad outcomes as opposed to trying to sort of maximize, I think that's a good idea. The recognition of nonlinearities and endogenities, that all the action is, in a certain sense, is on the feedback mechanisms. I think that's very important. You also mentioned at one point, Doug, recognizing the limitations of monetary policy, particularly at the zero lower bound. Absolutely agree. The effectiveness of monetary policy depends on credibility, which is endogenous. Again, totally agree. The fact that the output gap required to maintain price stability is different from what you need to maintain financial stability. I think that's a very important finding. So there's just so many ways, it seems to me, that you're really sort of moving in the right direction. Now, having said that, I did want to raise some other questions where I was not sort of entirely convinced. One of them was talking about dark corners. Well, I absolutely believe in that. I mean, we're talking about nonlinearities and you're getting into dangerous territory here. What I do want to raise is the question of whether we're putting too much emphasis on the dark corner of getting inflation wrong, as opposed to the dark corner of generating financial instability. And this is really important because if on the one hand you're saying, I have to keep monetary policy easy to avoid the dark corner of deflation, and that's exactly the set of circumstances that generates the dark corner of financial instability, clearly we've got a problem here that we have to face up to. The second question that I raise is this business about symmetric monetary policies, whether you should always lean against deflationary policies with the same vigor as you lean against inflationary policies. And I'm not so sure, in part because if you've got productivity increases, there's a certain tendency for prices to go down. And there's a huge pre-war literature about this saying, in fact, you probably ought to let the prices go down. Secondly, of course, if you feel that there's a kind of nominal bound for wages downwards, okay, there's a constraint downwards, then clearly there's less of a chance of a disruptive deflation than there is a chance of a disruptive inflation. So again, I just raised the question about symmetry. The business about tightening monetary policy aggressively when central bank credibility is threatened. Think about, this is the current situation in which we find ourselves, where these guys are behind the ball. And we're saying on the one hand, you need more aggressive tightening to maintain your credibility. But the more aggressive tightening at the current juncture has got two problems associated with it. One of them is financial instability, about which we know very little, okay? But there's a lot of creaking going on out there where things are starting to look as if it's coming unstuck. The second thing is the fiscal side, that if you have a situation as now, where governments are in large part effectively bankrupt in a kind of intergenerational accounting sense, the worry is that you get a big increase in interest rates that then significantly increases the fiscal deficit, okay, because of the debt servicing charge. And all of a sudden you're into a Sergeant Wallace kind of world where people start worrying about fiscal dominance. And so you could have a situation where aggressive tightening would actually lead to a loss of credibility in the inflation framework as opposed to gaining that credibility. And the last question I want to raise is about supply side shocks. And we've heard a number of people comment about how the central banks got the supply side wrong during the pandemic. I think there are grounds for belief that we have systematically underestimated the importance of disinflationary pressures coming out of real side developments like the baby boom and globalization and the rest of it. And so that our mistakes in terms of central bank policy making and modeling on the supply side really go back a very long way. And that's a deficiency that really worries me, because as you look forward, I think there's just so many negative supply shocks coming down the road, not least of which deglobalization, climate change, demographics. There's a whole list of these things. And what those supply shocks will do is they're going to aggravate the conflict between aggressive easing and maintaining credibility and all the other problems that we've got associated with aggressive easing. So I guess my sense of looking at your stuff on the web is that there's a lot of stuff that I think is really impressive as in terms of useful developments to recognize past shortcomings. But I think, as both the previous gentlemen suggested, there's still a lot of work yet to do. So I guess my only hope would be that this conference and the agenda is very, very rich, is really going to help move that agenda forward, because I think it's a very, very worthwhile agenda to follow.